He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.
Well, hello again. Islands at War podcast here. Welcome to you. I'm Keith Bengelli and I'm with
Nick Lahire. Morning, Keith.
Great to be back with everybody, and we focus in this episode on the month of March 1941. And if you're joining us for the first time, essentially we seek to cover off the occupation of the Channel Islands, bailiwick of Guernsey more accurately, during the time of the general occupation from 1940 to 1945. We're up to March 1941, which I said, but we do occasionally head off into what we call specials. Anyway, here we go. So, Nick, 1941 already, March, come through the first winter into the first spring of occupation.
Albeit the weather was not very good.
It wasn't at all. It was, we're complaining at the moment about the amount of rain that we've got here, but it was pretty cold, I think, and damp.
Yeah, there was a mixture. The weather seemed to be pretty mixed for March 1941. I knew say that because a couple of the diarists refer to what the weather was like. And it seems to be that March started with a bit of snow, quite heavy at times, which is most unusual for Guernsey. It's so rare that we get, reasonably heavy snow.
Yeah. And again, for people that don't know the topography of Guernsey, we're only 24 square miles, surrounded by the sea, obviously, and we can get parochial variations. I lived in St Martin's when I was a child, and we would get snow which would lie around for quite some time. And in this part of the island, where we are now in the north, at sea level, we're
absolutely nothing.
No.
Yeah.
And of course, the reason for emphasising it is that people were, really starting to not so much to get used to, but having to get used to the deprivations of rationing, etc. People feel the cold when they're hungry, tired, and emotional. They hadn't seen family for some time. So we're going to kick off with some social and civilian affairs this week. And we turn to food. Bread rationing was to be introduced to £6 a week per person. All rolls and cakes are now forbidden. And you've got quite a bit on the distribution of bread and such.
Yeah. So what they introduced was with this bread rationing, which obviously came out of the shortage of the supplies required to make bread, predominantly the flour, of course, and already the bread was of reasonably poor quality because of the flour that they were being provided by the purchasing committee, because that's all they could get their hands on, because nobody in France was wanting to sell them, the best quality flour. They were keeping that for themselves. So you had poor quality bread. It had to be rationed. It was £6 of bread a week per person. And they did have some extra rules. So anybody doing heavy work got £6, 2.5 ounces per week. All other males, it became £4, 10 ounces per week. Females doing heavy work, they got £5, 6.25 ounces per week. All other females got £4, 10 ounces per week. They set up, along with this, that we talked a little bit about transport and the issues with that in past episodes. What they did was they set up depots where you could collect bread from all around the island. And there were quite a few. That the whole of this order and the list of depots takes up pretty much a whole page of the Guernsey Press. I've got a copy of that press, actually. So what I'll do is I'll stick an image on the notes for this podcast.
Just to interject there, because even in the early 60s, when I was a lad living up St Martin's, we would have, in our road, bread deliveries from several different bakeries that were going at the time. We had Town Mills, we had Perel, we had Bordeaux. They all had their vans. And this is in the early 70s. So there were actually bakeries around the island as well.
Yeah, there were. Yeah, there were bakeries. Although as time went on, things got slightly more centralised, so there weren't so many operating.
So the bakeries were more centralised maybe in St Peterborough themselves, and it's the depots that were...
Yeah, the depots were all around the island, as you'll see from the list. But they cut down on the number of bakeries because obviously they wanted to be as efficient with the fuel and flour, etc., as possible. Other things worth noting as well was that the milk was so separated now because obviously they were trying to make as much butter, etc., as possible, that it became known as whitewash.
Yes.
And for listeners that aren't familiar with Guernsey milk, it is very creamy.
It's a meal in itself.
Indeed, depending on which one you have. So, for it to go from, being very, very creamy milk to something that is being termed as whitewash can't have been great for those that were drinking it. Cooking fats as well were really difficult to find by this point. So, which is somewhat at odds with some of the recipes that I've seen in the paper for March 1941, where they're talking about using cooking fat, etc., in their recommended recipes for the week. So, yeah, I mean, obviously that was working on the basis you could actually get your hands on any.
Okay, so we move on now to, I was looking at fuel and utilities, and it might be worth mentioning to listeners that Nick made an allusion to diarists. There are plenty of diaries that have been written and published, many also written and not published that we have access to. And they do vary in veracity, but the main ones that have been published lately, the Reverend Ord, for example, his diaries are felt to be relatively accurate. He was a German speaker. He was a Methodist minister. He was well connected with the Germans in the sense that they went to his church and confided in him. So I think with Ord, Nick, we can pretty much feel that his diary entries are relatively accurate. He's talking about electric light here. Electric light use is to be curtailed. There is to be no use between 11 p.m. and 7 p.m.
7 a.m.
So, 7 a.m. Well, of course, as well, the time, we were on German time at that time.
Yep. 2 hours ahead.
So when would it have been getting? It would have been getting dark later. So 11 p.m. was just after darkness, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it was sort of pitch black till about 10 o'clock in the morning. You see in some of the diaries.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, depending on the time of year. Just with talking about Ord, agree. It's a great source. He generally corrects things if he a few days later he finds out something that he's written in the diary isn't actually quite correct, and he is very skeptical as well, which I like, because he'll write down.
He questions things. Yeah.
He does question things. He'll make a note of something that he's been told in the diary, perhaps with a little sharp comment next to it, shall we say, saying something about simple people.
Yeah.
But if it turns out that what it was true, then he'll say it was, or if it wasn't, But also, we've got the benefit of looking at the other diaries as well to see what's
referencing
recorded in them, as well as looking at the official records in the archives and things like that. I talked to Jim Delbridge on Radio Guernsey actually last Sunday, just about rumours, lies, and why, just to explain, why these sort of rumours got about. They had nothing else to do really. So if they'd see, someone would see something happen. And then by the time you'd heard it 23rd hand,
everyone had gilded the lily.
Yeah, absolutely, because there was not a lot to do. So gossip, and also fear of what was going on, because we're not even a year into the occupation at this point.
Well, social media nowadays is often like that as well. Never let the truth get in the way of a good story, they say.
Absolutely.
Back to fuel and utilities. Electrical devices may no longer be sold. So this is presumably people selling each other cookers or washing machines, irons and electric fires and things. This is on ultimately a directive from the German authorities. This is not telling people they can't go to the shops and find these things. This is to stop people buying and selling between themselves.
No, I think it's actually to stop you from buying them, full stop.
Oh, right. So because it would increase consumption. Yes, of course.
I think it's the other way around. You could buy them second hand, but you couldn't, go into shop. To be fair, it's pretty unlikely a shop's going to have anything to sell you.
No.
Because getting your hands on them would have been very difficult.
And coal shortages. Ord makes a reference to. I've actually put 4th of July on my notes. 14th of July, I don't know why I've done that. 14th of March, coal shortages may affect gas supplies. And so most people would have been on gas or gas bottles back in those days, I suppose.
I'm not sure, actually. I don't know if it was gas bottles.
Gas mantles. My house, and in fact this very room we're in, if you were to turn around, you would see the grooves in the wall where the gas pipes came down. They were here when we bought the house 30 years ago. So I think people there was probably more of a mains gas distribution.
Quite likely. I'm not sure that they would have had gas bottles as such.
Because we're thinking of it nowadays.
About modern.
Gas being used for cooking. Of course, in the old days, gas would have been
used for
lighting.
Lighting.
The mantles were in our house when we bought it, as I say, and out here in this very building.
The other problem, of course, was that if you didn't have gas, you were still impacted by this because they made some very strict rules about distribution and rationing of coal. So that also had that problem. So if you didn't have gas and you were relying on the fact that you had fireplaces in your house and you were using coal fires, you were also suffering because of this.
Yeah, I mean, I've alluded to the fact that my poor grandmother was trying to bring up a big family of old people and youngsters, and it must have been the devil's own job to try and keep all these, juggle all of these things that were happening all of the time. Talking about the curfew, Ord makes a note that the curfew is to be extended from 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock, so this predated the change we just talked about, to enable those interested to attend a boxing match at the Regal on the 8th of March. And the Regal, most people would know as the Odeon, though it's been gone these 30 years?
Almost 40.
Almost 40.
1982, I think it was.
Yeah, I remember it well, but that's
in fact, it's more than 40 years. That's 42 years. And the Gaumont has been gone since 1985. I read that the other day, actually.
Oh, dear. Okay, so anyway, there was to be a huge boxing match. It's in fact sold out. And the organist played popular melodies during the interval. Well, and when he played Roll Out the Barrel, the crowd raised the roof, and the German officers present were not amused.
I can imagine. We see a lot of this, that the cinemas, because they've got no films to show other than German ones, or just rerunning ones that they already had, they look to do other things. So they, put on cabaret shows, boxing matches. There were a number of boxing matches held at the Regal. I imagine that was probably the most suitable venue out of all of them. And so you do see these occasional variations to the curfew to extend it, to allow people to attend these things.
Amateur dramatics as well was something that was very, very popular.
Oh yeah,
back in the wartime.
Yeah, and some of the groups are still around now. So,
they are. Yeah.
You get the likes of St. Stephen's Players and people like that. They're talked about in the newspapers of the time, including reviews of shows and things like that. Lots and lots of people got involved in these. Oh yeah,
I was a member of Gaddock 30 odd years ago. Yeah. Okay, so we also move on to the Germans again, emphasising that all weapons, including hunting guns, must be given up.
Yeah, they did that, but also for the first time ever, they included aeroplanes or parts thereof because of a discovery, which I think we talked about briefly last month, but the unfortunate young manager of Motorhouse Garage, he'd been left in charge when the owners left the
this
island.
Is at the top of St. Julian's Avenue.
Yes, yeah.
For those that knew some people.
Most recently was EFG Bank, I think.
Yeah.
And he'd been left in charge by the owners, and in the loft was the bits of a small aircraft which had been built in the 1930s, which was called We Might. And I think We Might Fly was probably, as well as the reference to being small. It hadn't had an illustrious flying career. I've got a photograph of it that I'll put a link to on the show notes, and it's not very big. I believe it made 2 flights, one of which ended up with it becoming inverted shortly after takeoff and crashing, although nobody was injured. But it was in bits in the top of Motorhouse Garage. Now, Ken Bell, thinking he was doing the right thing, went and got some advice. What should I do? he went up to Elizabeth College and asked for advice from the civilian government. What should I do? And they said, look, you should report this. So he duly reported it, thought, I'm doing the right thing, told the Germans about it. It's like, it's in bits, it's in the top of this loft, quite how you'd have got it, out and reassembled it, even if it was in a fit state to fly, is another matter, because you'd have had to transport it a long way.
You're going to sneeze there, Nick.
Yeah, sorry about that. You'd have had to transport it a long way to get a flat area to be able to take off. And frankly, would you actually make it anywhere in it? Probably not. However, the Germans took a very serious view of this matter, and they were quite convinced that it was there for somebody to use it to fly to England. Not helped by the fact that they tried starting the engine and it did actually start first time.
Mm.
So they decided to cart off poor old Kenny Bell and put him through quite some horrible times up at Fort George being questioned. It really wasn't a pleasant experience for him, and he spent most of March in Fort George being questioned by the Germans, locked in a room in the dark with no window, and all because he'd done what he thought was the right thing. Now the Germans made themselves look really stupid because they put a guard on this, so they had soldiers guarding the building for several weeks. Quite why they didn't just take it away.
Mm-hmm.
In the end, a deal was done and Ken Bell was allowed out, provided that a new Yale lock was put on the door that led to the attic to prevent this aircraft being removed from it and the key handed to the Germans.
I mean, we've got a picture here that you found of this at Vasseln Beach. It's an interesting looking plane. How that would have managed to have been made airborne on the Germans, not noticing it in the air at the very least. But
do you want a bigger laugh? The Germans, when they were questioning Kenny Bell, kept referring to it variously as a military aircraft or a fighter aircraft. I've not seen anything that looks less like
in an alternative universe,
a 1940s fighter aircraft. But there we go. That was a horrible experience for him.
We'll get that picture put up. We could probably tweet it or something like that. Okay, so I think that draws a line under that interesting episode. What else have we got here? There's a fresh appeal for rubber, old motor tyres, cycle tyres, worn inner tubes. I think they were you sort of hand these in and get paid threepence.
Yeah, they were giving a small amount of money in return for you handing over. Now, one of the other diarists, an unpublished one that I've read, I was looking through March 1941, and they comment that this seems somewhat at odds for, if you look at the front page of the Guernsey Press with all the German propaganda, that everything's going absolutely brilliantly. Aren't we wonderful? We've got all these weapons. We're manufacturing all these amazing bits of kit. And then they're scraping around for rubber in Guernsey.
Yes, I mean, of course, the background to this is rubber. Rubber would have been sourced at the time mainly from places like Malaysia and such, and the Japanese hadn't yet entered the war. But of course, these were all part of the then existing British Empire. So
indeed,
the Germans would have been really. It's one of those commodities that Germany had no natural access to, did they?
Yeah. That was a big problem for them. So these old tyres and things like that were being purchased from people locally were being shipped off back to Germany and presumably recycled into.
Yeah, and it's a perfect example of how the big requirements trickle down, percolate down to the man in the street. Mate, you're not doing anything with that in a tube. Just give it to us. We'll sell it to us.
Yeah.
Okay, we move through it here to, and this is one, Nick, that listeners may be able to help with. It's to do with the sale of alcoholic drinks, which may now not be served before 8:30 to either civilians or military other ranks.
After 8:30.
Yeah, after 8:30.
Yeah.
Did I say?
You said before.
No, sorry, well done.
Before 8:30 in the morning might be a bit...
Yeah. Okay, just to go through that again, so we're absolutely clear. Alcoholic drinks may now not be served after 8:30 p.m. to either civilians or other military ranks, but officers may be served until 10:30 p.m. in both the Hotel Normandy and the Royal Hotel. Now, we know where the Royal Hotel was, and the Hotel de Normandy was something that I heard bandied around when I was younger. We're not absolutely sure where.
Yeah, no, it's not. I don't think it's where the Duke of Normandy Hotel is.
I don't think it is either.
I'm guessing, and this is just a guess, but I think it was along the seafront near the Royal Hotel as well,
where the Savoy used to be.
Yeah, somewhere along there, I think. Not as quite as far as Salary Corner, but so anyone that's listening that can help us pinpoint that. But we will do our own research as well. Nick will have found out by lunchtime, I would have thought. That's an interesting one. So we'd like to hear from anybody that might know. You can get hold of us at occupied@gnetradio.com. We'll get that out later in the podcast. Okay. Another interesting thing here, Nick, is appeared in the local paper. Owners of ferrets and dogs suitable for rat catching were asked to contact the Rat Destruction Committee based at Sunray Park. Yeah, I've got a copy of the advert for this as well. Yeah, there was a problem with rats and no way to keep them down. Of course, nobody had any guns because you'd had to hand them in. So even air weapons. So, you couldn't do anything about, trying to kill them off. So they were wanting people to do this and paying a reward for doing it. Just going back to the change to the licensing laws, there was method in their madness for the 8:30 one, which was basically to stop people from ordering. That was half an hour before normal curfew. Yeah, so they wanted to stop people from ordering another drink and then, wandering off after 9 o'clock, wandering around the streets of Guernsey. So there was a reason for that. Quite why they applied it to the other ranks, I'm not sure. No. But as you say, officers were allowed to carry on drinking till 10:30.
Presumably wine was coming in from France. Was there still a brewery running here at the time?
I think beer had probably run out by then, because certain ingredients that you need for making beer were being required for food. There was a lot of, and in a lot of cases I've read, it's been said that a lot of poor quality wine and cider being brought in from France. The best stuff, obviously, not willing to be parted with by the French traders.
No, again, I remember when only less than a mile from here, as the crow flies across the fields, I remember going to the old Lancrest Lodge Hotel, sadly no more, and one of the chaps there, Ron Sabir, was telling me that he used to go there during the war, and it was just got rut red wine. I think it was just a case of people wanted to get out and meet and feel relatively free, although the Germans would have been in the next room or in the same room. People could at least get together and drink anything as long as it wasn't vinegar, I think.
Yeah, and you do see tales of court reports of people being found drunk. There were a couple actually in the Guernsey presses that I looked through before we were recording this, and people being fined for being found drunk. Now, how they got their hands on that enough to get drunk, I'm not really sure.
Okay, it was also announced that a new restaurant was to be opened in St Sampson's. Food was to be provided by the states. The states, for people listening, when we refer to the states, we mean our government, states of deliberation. So the food was actually provided by the government, and the cost of a meal was not to exceed £6, and takeaways were also available.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about the prospect of takeaways.
Yeah, well, it's a term that we use now, but really you could just go and take a cooked meal away with you. It's by definition a takeaway. And of course, this was mainly for men who had perhaps unable to feed themselves once their families had evacuated. I mean, we forget possibly us men are able to do most things nowadays around the kitchen. We can burn an omelette and whatever. But in those days, men just were nowhere near cooking. And when their wives and families had left, they really had no idea how to put put a meal together. They have to obtain the ingredients, even cook it.
Yeah, there were, obviously men that weren't able to cook for themselves or look after themselves, but also other tasks like darning socks, repairing clothes, and things like that were also services offered by this establishment. There were the women that worked there all volunteered, and they did all sorts of tasks, even taking in washing for these men. And of course, St John's residential home in Sunbury Park came about from a similar problem, that there were men living on their own in a house who were unable to look after themselves properly. So that was established.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it as well, again, we come back to this thing about transport. It did say that the restaurant would be opened in St Sampson's. It doesn't say where. I would think it's on the bridge.
It was
somewhere.
On the bridge, yeah, it was on the bridge.
And there was a suggestion that these establishments would open up again around the island, so people didn't have to move from one part of the island to another in order to get this meal, because some people just wouldn't have been able to do it. It wouldn't have been practical in any sense of, there was no sort of taxis that could take you there to buy a sixpence meal.
No. Although I did discover the other day that there, much to my surprise, given the restrictions on transport, there were actually 3 taxis available.
Right.
At this time, at this period of the occupation, although they were only allowed for certain things, so you could use them basically to go to weddings. So if you needed a wedding car, you could use them for that, or for funerals, or for transporting the sick or disabled. If they needed to go for a doctor's appointment or something like that, and there was no other way of transporting them, then you could book these taxis. That undoubtedly would not have continued throughout the occupation, but that was still possible in March 1941, which I hadn't even thought about, the fact there might have been taxis available for any type of thing, because of all the restrictions on use of private cars, if you still had your private car, if it hadn't been
when I was
bought by the Germans in inverted commas on the boat.
If you went in a taxi when I was a child, it was an event you remember for months and months. Well, obviously years, because I remember it. You've got you brought in a piece here, more Red Cross messages that will set anxious minds at rest. Did you have a little on this?
Yeah, this just for our listeners who may be unaware, but the Red Cross messages were very, very short messages that you could send on a form to and from Guernsey. It started out at, you could only write 10 words, not very helpful. You can't really say a lot. And they used to take about 3 months to send one and then get a reply through the Red Cross. So as a result of the fact you didn't get an awful lot of information, the Guernsey Press took to getting people to bring in their Red Cross letters and let them know, what people were saying, and they printed them by parish in the paper, so people could have a look and see if people that they knew had been in contact with a relative or friend, and if they were okay, or see what the news was. It
was a sort of indirect way of, the messages couldn't have been too intimate, they couldn't have been too personal, so it wouldn't have been a bad thing to share it with people. So someone gets a Red Cross message in Guernsey from, let's say, their daughter that's living in Manchester. Then what happens is that this then goes to the Guernsey Press from the recipient.
Yeah.
It is then collated into parishes. So somebody living in St Peter's who might vaguely know Mrs Rebillard knows that Mrs Rebillard's daughter, who they might know in Manchester, has written to her mum.
Yep.
So it's a sort of social networking
in a very crude fashion. And one of the really important messages that was got out through this medium, the one that I've found from early in March, was one gentleman who was a bank manager for the National Provincial in Guernsey. He'd been evacuated, and he sent a message which said, "Advise all, I am helping families," which must have been, the headline is more Red Cross messages that was set anxious minds at rest. Bank manager's reassurance, advise all, I am helping families, which must have been, a great comfort to people to know that there were people who were able to help. Also, the state's liaison officer continued to aid island evacuees. That was also sent in a Red Cross message as well. So, that must have helped people who were feeling very anxious about it. But there's a whole piece about this in the Guernsey Press, which I'll share that as well with the show notes. But it talks about how they're helping people, and now they've assembled this story from basically a set of Red Cross messages that were sent by people who held sort of senior positions here and had gone with the evacuees to try and help organise things in England.
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy to sort of, what's the right term, misunderstand the power of receiving these messages from loved ones. I mean, I'll give you an example. We might have our grandchildren for the weekend, and by Tuesday, my daughter might send a picture of them doing a school activity, and we've seen them 48 hours before. It was fantastic to see the picture. I mean, this is a picture of someone you've seen only hours before. Imagine what it must be like to find out that someone had successfully had a baby and everything was fine, and it was in time of war. I think it's very easy to overlook these very, very what appear to be mundane but parts of life must have had huge impact in those days, both when it happens and also the absence of when it doesn't happen.
Well, when messages stop coming, that's when people become very
especially
anxious.
With bombing and such.
Yeah, absolutely, and all the propaganda on the papers. People do become very, very anxious if they don't receive a message. Now, of course, part of the reason they didn't receive a message sometimes was that the messages got intercepted. The ship that they were on was torpedoed or whatever. So there was always that worry. One thing that I did like on this article, where it says they're carrying on fine work. The state's supervisor has heard from Mr. J.T. Robert, formerly Assistant Secretary to the Education Council. Mr. Robert states he is well, December 18th, and continuing the same job. And it goes on to say, Mr. Robert further states that Mr. Gagan, the state's auditor, has been of great assistance in this work. And I'm giving him a mention because when I started in my career in accountancy, I actually worked for KPMG, which also had the local practice Blackgagan and Till. So I used to work for them back in 1987 onwards.
I'll meet you on that one, because when I started at Carnaby's, which I think were previously Carnaby, Harrower and Budge or something, suitably Dickensian, one of the senior partners' father was still around, and he'd helmed the company through the war. Ken Rowe, I think. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's a
possibly
John Rowe, who was
know.
at BDO. Anyway, well, that's one of those things. Okay, moving on from. Had you finished on that particular?
Yeah,
topic?
no, I just thought it's an interesting. It's an interesting thing, and they carried on publishing those for quite some time. Although there were periods when the newspaper, I've mentioned this before, during the course of the occupation, the newspaper changes size numerous times just because of a shortage of paper and things like that.
Yeah, and we know the Guernsey Press, and we always talk about the press in the same way as, we just talk about the press. But of course, the Star was a separate newspaper still?
Yep, the Star was still a separate newspaper at that point. They initially were published on carried on publishing on the same day. So you'd had choice of newspapers, although to be fair, the front page is probably going to be very much the same. Being as it came from the German propaganda, all the official notices would be the same. So it's only the rest of the content that might be different.
And of course, it became the Guernsey Press and Star.
Yeah.
It certainly was in the late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah, absolutely. They carried on publishing both, as I say, during the course of the occupation. They one point went down to publishing on alternate days.
I can imagine.
Due to a shortage of things. But both newspapers, they change size frequently. Well, not frequently, but fairly often during the course of the occupation, because just of the shortage of the paper, or they didn't have any paper of the normal size they used, so they had to use other paper, and also shortage of ink.
Yeah. Last month, Nick, you were talking about this sort of practical joke that went awry.
Yes.
You've got the sort of follow-up but it sort of went from February into March. Would you like to bring us up to date on that?
Yeah. So if you remember, when we talked about this last month, there was all this fuss. The Germans were convinced that there were parachutists, British parachutists, who'd been in the island for a couple of weeks now. Well, that's quite plausible that there could be British troops here, because we've had the commando raids. There's been several. So,
So parachutists, they don't mean sort of parachuted troops in. These are spies that have been parachuted in.
No, they thought there were a large number of parachutists.
Okay, so they thought a battalion or a platoon or something.
Yeah, no, just as, and I think they thought, there were sort of 20 or 30 of them on the loose, meeting in Cambridge Park, which I still find hilarious, because it's a lovely park, but it's only got trees down really one side and a few more around the other side of it. It's a big, wide open space. So.
And surrounded by German officers that are billeted
in the Duke of Normandy, in the Duke of Normandy hotel. I know. It's crazy. Anyway, but these two, it turns out these two maids in the house at Ivy Gates, who were 15 and 16 at the time, had thought that they would do this for a bit of a joke. So it got a bit out of hand, though, because they ended up getting arrested once the Germans worked it out, although not until after the Germans had spent quite some time in the bushes up there looking for the signals to be made from the house. So they got arrested, and they made one of the girls go to Cambridge Park because she confessed that, that's where she was meeting them, and they followed her a number of times, and then they worked out that basically she was just winding them up. Unfortunately, that meant that her and a totally innocent friend ended up locked up in prison and were actually sent to Jersey to be tried. And they ended up, I think it was one of them got 6 months, the other got 7 months in prison. So that really was one that backfired.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a few cases of these little things getting completely out of hand. The Germans not seeing the lighter side of it.
Yeah,
at all.
One I particularly like from around this time was the Germans expended a couple of weeks, apparently, searching the parishes of St Sampson's and the Vale for a Mr. Les Marais.
Oh, right, yes.
Which,
you're going to explain that one.
I better explain that one. So there is a place called Les Marais. They thought they were looking for a Mr. Les Marais.
Yeah, this is part of our Guernsey French heritage, with Les is Les, L-E-S, which is sort of the field, Les Courtil or something like that in Guernsey French. I came across, again, at the Langcrest Lodge, I came across a variant on this, a 1990s variant. There used to be a phone outside the public bar, and someone would go to this phone and phone up the barman and ask to speak to a Mr. Pete Module. So the barman, who'd come from England, would shout out, "Is there a Pete Module in the bar?" And of course everybody would yell and cheer, because a Pete Module was, of course, something that you grew tomato plants in. So it's a variation on the theme. You brought this in as well. The airport was problematic for the Germans.
Yeah, they were having severe problems at the airport, courtesy of the RAF, in more ways than one. So aside from the fact they bombed the airport a fair few times already, by the time we get to March 1941, they had also destroyed basically the drainage system at the airport before they left in June 1940. So this caused them real problems with landing some types of aircraft at the airport, particularly anything that had a fast landing speed. So the airport was flooding. There was one bombing attack where they dropped a bomb on the airport. It actually opened up a fairly high-pressure spring, which proceeded then to carry on gushing and flooding the airport, which gave the Germans great problems. They really, really couldn't get the water to stop from flooding the airfield. And it also caused the buried petrol tanks that had been landscaped over to actually pop out the ground. Not that they had much petrol in them, which is partly why they popped out the ground, because getting the petrol here was a bit of a problem. They also had problems because they managed to crash a troop carrier in Albany at the same time. So yeah, the One other thing that I did like was the Germans were building some new hangars up there, and I'd like to think this is true. I can't prove it either way, but I've seen an awful lot of references to the fact that the Germans, the RAF had dropped some photographs of the new hangars on the field as a kind of, we know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And they were building lots of hangars up there, and there were attacks on them, which led to danger money for the people that were working there.
Oh, I mean local people.
Yeah.
That were, say, press gang. The firms were engaged really, and it gave people employment. Again, it's these. We must make it clear that local firms were often engaged to work for the military. Firms didn't have any choice particularly. But this is completely separate to Organisation Todd and the slave workers, which is something we covered off in our Fortress special.
Yeah.
2 parts Fortress special, which is still available on the platforms. We go back, Nick, I'd like to take you back to Ord, where he's talking about one night his house is shaken by a powerful detonation. A stick of German bombs have been dropped by a German aircraft just 60 yards behind his house. Now, they seem to be just jettisoned, and they fell into swampy ground, and some of them didn't detonate and were difficult to recover. Why would they just dump bombs?
Quite possibly the aircraft was damaged, and they were just trying to get rid of that before
the ballast. Yeah.
Before they landed. There were other instances of this recorded that happened around Capels and also near St Saviour's Church, as I'm aware of.
Yeah,
similar thing happening around there.
It's just for people listening that do live in the island, and those of you expats that live off island. Ord actually lived at the top of the Rohays, you will know where that is, near Ivy Gates, and we were just trying to think what might be behind those houses. We're not really sure. It must be fields. I
would imagine at the time it was probably fields.
Yeah. And it's near the crematorium, so it's the other side of the valley. Will that come down there? That's sort of Grave.
Yeah,
we're struggling.
We're struggling. I mean, it could have landed in field behind Ivy Gates, because there are some quite steep fields. But
there were no fatalities. So anyway, to have a stick of bombs dropped just 60 yards behind your house isn't pleasant at the best of times.
Not ideal.
Also, Ord talks about reinforcements coming in. He records the largest vessel ever seen in St. Peter Port Harbour brings in around 2,000 men. Now, we were talking about this before we started recording. I'm of the opinion that it sort of falls in line with Hitler's desire, again, as we talked about in the fortification specials, to reinforce the island in case there was an attempt by the British to recover the island. You're slightly more sceptical about the figure.
Yeah, I'm slightly. I agree. It was to reinforce the island. They were worried about things like commando attacks on Norway and things like that. I can't pronounce the name of it. It's the islands off Norway.
Lofoten?
That's the one.
Lofoten.
That's the one. They were worried about an attack of that sort of style happening here, and what he absolutely didn't want was for them to get kicked out of the Channel Islands. So there is that. Yeah, 2,000 on one ship sounds a little bit toppy to me. I just think there's certainly a large number of Germans. There are accounts of, that noticeably there were a lot of Germans in the streets following this arrival, etc.
Yeah, it talks about the shops being full again, like originally, but of course they would have found much less to purchase and take away at this time. The thing about Ord, of course, is we should remind people is that he was a German speaker, and German officers went to the church and confided in him, so he was relatively well connected.
Absolutely, yeah, he was indeed. One of the funniest things about Ord actually is where we talk about the rumours that he hears and things like that. He does in fact hear a rumour that he has been arrested.
Oh, right. Okay. He himself has been.
This is later on. This is 1944. Yeah. He appears to be most amused by the fact that someone passes on the rumour to him that the Reverend Ord has been arrested.
Yeah. Well, again, it's worth probably we have talked about. We've got some. We have produced and broadcast some specials that take us away from the month by month framework. We are in about a month's time looking to interview Steve Foote of Blue Ormer Publishing, and Steve published The Ord Diaries, which had been edited by John Nettles, and Steve has published a number of books that are related to the occupation. So Steve will come in and we're going to talk about those books, how he originally comes into possession of the manuscripts and how they go through the process and are turned out as fully published books, and of great value they are. And one of the things that does spring to mind, Nick, going back to talk about the Red Cross messages, the way that that information was disseminated throughout the island. Because Donald Banks, the famous Sir Donald Banks, the famous Guernseyman, he started off the Guernsey Review, which Steve is now the editor of, I think. And that, of course, kept Guernsey people, bailiwick people, Channel Island people, in touch with one another in the UK. So there's another side to that will
the Channel Island Monthly Review.
Yeah, well, I think we'll probably get Steve to talk on that in due course. So that would be good. Okay, so anything else on your?
Yeah, probably one of the biggest stories and nuisances for the local populace was a notice that was published on the 19th of March following an act of sabotage. Now, whether it was sabotage or not, we'll come to in a minute. And the notice said, on account of the act of sabotage, which in the notice it doesn't actually say what the act of sabotage was. I know what it was, but we'll come to that in a mo. I order, in agreement with the island commandant, the following. Now, you can tell this was written by the Germans because they Guernsey Press let the bad use of English, it doesn't quite make sense in places, slip through, because they used to do that to just go, oh, well, that's what they said, to put in the notice. So although it's a civilian, processing it at the Guernsey Press, they just follow exactly what they're told. So, 1, the curfew for the population is from 9 p.m. to 7 a.m, so they've just made the curfew slightly longer in the morning. 2, the states of Guernsey have to report daily in writing to the Incel Commandantur starting on 19th of March 1941 until 12 noon, 60 men, 18 to 45 years of age. I don't know, how do you report men in writing? But anyway, who are used in accordance with the island commandant's order for performing guarding tasks during night time. So essentially that bit of the order was that they had to get this group of 60 men and they had to go and guard the airport because it was a telephone cable that was allegedly cut or not cut.
Well, yes, exactly. It may not have been cut. It may have just come down.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a mo. And number 3 in the order, it says, I especially draw attention to the most severe penalties for acts of sabotage, brackets, death sentence, signed to the field commandant. Now, cut telephone lines near the airport. It's slightly problematic because there were a number of times it was proved that these phone lines were broken rather, during the middle of the night when nobody could have been around them and things like that. So that wasn't really an act of sabotage. Generally speaking, they were, chewed through by a cow or something like that. But the Germans were actually quite careless with how they were setting up these telephone lines and quite lazy at some point. So you'll probably remember when I interviewed Melva Stacey, Melva told me about a time when she was cycling to work and she felt something around her throat and thought somebody, was trying to knock her off a bike with a rope or something like that. And then she realised it was in fact a telephone line that had come down. This was because the Germans had a habit of just looping them round trees to get them across roads. So telephone lines got cut, unsurprisingly, when lorries went along the road if they hadn't put the telephone line up high enough. So, it wasn't always sabotage. But in this case, they were saying, telephone lines were cut. The men were supplied from the 5 parishes nearest the airport, and they had to guard the phone line for 2 weeks before they gave up on this. But when they were guarding the phone line, they had to take it in turns to walk the length of the phone line with it in their hand, effectively, to check that it wasn't broken up, during which time they were not allowed to speak at all.
No, so I'm just looking at the age range. My family were in St Martin's at the time and beyond, but we had no one of that age range in the family, so it wouldn't have been something that affected our family.
Yeah. I mean, another thing that came out of this was that the bailiff gave an address to the state's deputies, which is effectively our government. So it'd be like somebody going into the House of Commons and making a statement, which was much criticised actually, because he condemned such acts. Now, if you look at it with all the benefit of all the information that we have, now, we know that he was, towing a very fine line to try and, keep the Germans from doing awful things. So what most people at the time wouldn't have known was the Germans were, at that time, for this act of sabotage, threatening to send 25 people off of their list of 50 prominent people that they had as identified, and they were going to send them as hostages and send them to camps in Europe. So he might have, not been very popular for making this speech, but it was for a reason.
Yeah. I mean, that's absolutely right. I'm going to bring in a little thing here which I'd forgotten to mention to you that came up recently, which you might have some input in. I was talking with Phil Martin of the Guernsey Channel, or the Channel Island Occupation Society, and we were talking about the legacy of the bombing on June the 28th, 1940. Excuse me. And Phil quite rightly pointed to the fact that whilst all of the people that died at the time and the day or so, or the day after that, commemorated, he went on to say how many people continued to suffer and pass away right up until the point that we are talking about now, March, the spring of 1941. So I'm hoping to do some research around that, where we can maybe identify these people and commemorate them. So that's something that we could probably look at. It's something that I'd never considered before, because the injuries sustained at the bombing were pretty horrific.
Yeah, and given the state of medicine at the time,
no antibiotics, paucity of care. So it's an important thing. I think Phil says there is a sort of a list somewhere.
Okay.
That could be interesting.
Yeah.
The other thing that Nick and I wanted to address was the fact that it's very nice. It's tremendous to have people write in and discuss elements of the occupation, and we've had a couple of emails from Rod. Thank you very much, Rod. That's something we're going to, the information that you've sent on to us, we're going to fill it into April's edition.
Yeah, the information is pertinent to April 1941, so
yeah,
we'll put that in there. I've already got it in the notes.
So anybody out there, if they've got any information at all or queries, they can get hold of us at occupied@gnetradio.com. And we also, Charlie, who regularly sends in, well, more than snippets of information, some really fantastic stuff from Charlie. And I think the thing on local steamers and such like, we'll get, Charlie, we're going to, by the time you hear this, you may well have heard from us, but we'd like to invite you in to have you talk about what you've written to us. So we're really quite impressed on that. Yeah,
absolutely. It's a really comprehensive email about shipping, which is quite an interesting subject to examine and doesn't get talked about very often.
So there's the basis for a long interview with Charlie there, if he wants to do so. I don't see why he wouldn't. And so it's not so much an appeal for information, but really feel free at any time to email us. It doesn't need to seat necessarily the month that we're talking about, because
absolutely
often these items can form the basis of a special, and I know that Rod talks about the diary that his great aunt left. And Rod, I think in an email back to you, sometimes the smallest thing can unlock a bigger mystery.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's absolutely fantastic that Rod took the time to drop us an email. But as you say, we love hearing from anybody that's listening to the program, be it questions or if you've got something to contribute, even better.
Yeah, so many of you may be picking the program up this podcast up on Spotify and Amazon and the plethora of platforms, including YouTube. But really, we go out under the auspices of Gnet Radio, and I'd sort of ask you to perhaps support Gnet Radio, which you can find at www.gnet.com. gnetradio.com, the website. You see our schedule and our Mixcloud facility. Now, the Mixcloud facility also includes the ability to access this podcast, but also it has our radio shows. There's one in particular, Rough and Rowdy Times, that is a musical supplement to this program. It's presented by myself. It's an hour long, so you can't get music programs as a podcast. You have to access them from Gnet Radio. Mixcloud, so I would flag up Rough and Rowdy Times, music from about 1920s up until the very early 60s. There's other programs myself. I do Two Fish and an Elephant, which is sort of American jazz, blues, world music, etc. And our other presenters, Simon Charwood and Martin Tolcher, with their shows, Songs from Under the Floorboards. And Simon, forgive me, Simon, you've changed the name of your show recently, but you'll find Simon's shows on the platform. So give our music shows a listen, because we're funded and sponsored by Guernsey Arts. And of course, next year is the 80th anniversary of the liberation. Guernsey Arts getting solidly behind that. We're slightly over. So did you have anything to say, Nick? You got Island Fortress?
Island Fortress. You can find me if you Google it. But yeah, Liberation 80, we might have something to say about that.
I'm sure we will.
In maybe a month's time, might be able to tell you a few things. We might have something lined up. I don't think I've mentioned that to you yet.
No, you haven't. It's good to hear, though.
It is. I had a very useful meeting this week, which, well, I'll tell you about after this. And sorry, everyone else that's listening, you're going to have to wait and find out. But we will have something in September about Liberation 80 and the run-up to it.
Good. Okay, I think that's us. And our next one will be April 1941.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb.